Hello, and welcome to the Election Protection Podcast, where we talk all things election integrity. We're joined today by Melissa Conway as part of our Innovators series. The Innovators series is where we talk to election integrity practitioners who are doing exceptional work in the field. Oftentimes, these are folks that at the Election Protection Project that we have worked with on various projects. And Melissa and I have gone back many years in our work together. Now she's the co-founder of the Texas Election Network, and we're going to have a great conversation about election integrity in Texas. Melissa, thanks for joining us.
So glad to be here with you face to face, back at it again.
That's right. Well, Melissa, before we get started, tell us a little bit about the Texas Election Network for people that may not know and how you got started in election integrity.
Well, I have about 25 years grassroots experience helping folks on the front lines at the local, state, and national level really engage in the political and the party process. And what I discovered in the midst of all of that is there is a real need, particularly as it pertains to our elections, to engage in process at that grassroots and that voter level in order to ensure that each and every one of our elections truly represents the voice, the heart, and the vote of our voters. And as such, I've been involved in election integrity efforts across the state of Texas since 2018 in particular, but actually worked alongside you at the national level when the National Program for Election Integrity was rolled out across the country. And then brought that heartbeat back to more specifically focus in Texas to make sure that regardless of what's happening at the national level through the party structure or even the state or the county level, that there is one continuity of support provided back to voters in the grassroots to ensure that you and me and we together, we the people can really protect our elections.
Well, one thing that I know that we've talked about a lot is the need for election integrity to be a full-time operation on the conservative side. And we know that it hasn't always been. And so, as we started kind of a national conservative election integrity effort, we realized that there was gaps in states. And we are so appreciative that you have stayed in Texas and provided a full-time election integrity presence. Now, one thing that I know that Texas Election Network does as well as anybody is education, grassroots education when it comes to election integrity. Tell us a little bit about the initiatives that you've been involved with when it comes to that education.
Yeah, so we really believe that the grassroots is the cornerstone of election integrity. And so we really have to educate and to equip and empower the grassroots to get engaged in every single phase and facet of the electoral process and even the legislative process. So we've developed training programs that really hit at the heart of where we need to have eyes, ears, and folks on the ground with regards to our election workers and our poll watchers, even folks involved in the early voting ballot board and signature verification and central count processes, making sure that they understand the law and what they should be looking at through the lens of election integrity. But more than that, at the county party level, it's integral that our county party leadership is well informed. Now, this is an area where the infrastructure isn't the strongest in supporting them, and especially with a lot of turnover. In Texas, we have about 35 to 40% turnover of our county party leadership each cycle. So what that means is the historical information about elections, it goes away, and maybe even the heartbeat or the focus of that chair changes. So we need to make sure that each and every chair is up to date with the law, but that they understand everything from LNA testing all the way to negotiating out primary contracts, to all the way to the end of the counting process, and even informing candidates about what that means if they want a challenge or a recount. So it's each and every phase. We serve as a continuity and a backbone of information legally and educationally to help support them.
Well, you're just diving into the reason that we wanted to bring you on as part of our innovators, right? And it's that training for county party chairs. A lot of our listeners may not know this. A lot of people that pay attention to election integrity may not even know that oftentimes in just about every state, the party has a statutorily, under the law, mandated responsibility to run its elections. And that is particularly powerful in Texas, where the county parties are responsible for running the primary elections. Now they can contract to entities, and sometimes they'll do it to the county to actually run it. But in Texas in particular, the county party chairs have a tremendous responsibility when it comes to election integrity. So you being there to do that training is tremendously important. Walk us through a little bit of these kind of unique responsibilities or heavy lifts that the county party chairs have that we've just got to make sure that they're trained well on.
Well, in Texas, we have among the largest election law, the longest number of pages of election law anywhere in the country. So that's a huge lift, over 1,100 pages of content to absorb. And that county party chair has the statutory authority and responsibility to negotiate out the primary contract, but they're also the primary face and vote, if you will, as it pertains to how the election is run within the county. And they're liaising across the aisle with folks that are county commissioners and county judges and your county clerks in order to ensure that the infrastructure of the election is well established and well run. They're also the voice for their party to ensure simple things like the location of a polling location, all the way to who the election workers will be, and even speaking with candidates and making sure that those candidates understand their roles, rights, and responsibilities under the law as a candidate as it pertains even specifically to election integrity. In Texas, those candidates have placement authority of 2 poll watchers per polling location, and just having those extra set of eyes and guardians of the election, that makes a huge difference in the integrity and the way voters look at the safety of our elections. So that's just a little bit of it, but those county chairs are also responsible for the fundamental training. So they have to be well trained. They need to understand processes and even what they need to communicate, as well as how they need to credential each and every one of those workers and watchers once they're placed. So all of those interworkings of the election process become very important. And so we walk with them through that process to make sure they're statutorily compliant, but also that they understand the ramifications of the choice that they make in executing the role that they have in their authority.
I think it's really important to note that Texans believe in freedom above all else, right? And they believe in individual responsibility. And under the law, and a lot of states did this, but we've gotten away from it a little bit. They trusted the citizens to run their own elections. And the way that citizens organized was in the political parties, right? That's why both parties have roles in the process. So often we're taking a stance these days nationally that we don't trust the citizens to run elections, especially this happens in blue states, right? But when you take the power away from the people, it just leads to distrust in process and results, and it leads to election administrators taking these actions that may be against transparency and security. So one thing that I want to emphasize, and I know you kind of talked over this a little bit, but especially in primary elections in Texas, the Republican Party is responsible for running its elections. The Democrat Party is responsible for running its primary elections. Now, it's hard to run an election, so they can contract with a third-party entity, which is usually your local election administrator, to run those. But ultimately, the county party has responsible for running, especially its primary elections.
Yeah, and when it comes down to it, the folks that comprise the county party, in addition to the county chair, they're folks like you and me. They are individuals who have engaged in process. And liberty is not a spectator sport. That means you and me, we the people, we have to get engaged in process. And the way that we do that is by plugging in at that party level and showing up to be a worker and watcher and really understanding how the law applies. If we want to protect our freedom, if we want to protect our liberty, we have to be engaged in process.
That's right. So tell us a little bit about the trainings that you're doing for these county party chairs. I think this is incredibly unique. I'm not sure that there are any other states that I've seen that do training specifically for county party chairs. So tell us a little bit about that.
So I will say that in Texas, the Secretary of State does a county party training over election law. And then, depending upon who the state party chair is, sometimes there is training for the county party leadership specifically about the primary or bits and pieces. But what we attempt to do is a holistic approach. It's not just here and there. It really is at each and every single phase. So we break it down into the comprehensive look is broken down into many modules of training, which is very specific how to, by the law as well as best practice, apply the law for everything from strategizing and launching the election process, curating those lists and making sure that they're submitted back to Commissioner's Court for approval in a way that is workable for you as a county party leader. How do you engage in the recruiting process? How do you engage in the communication process? How do you engage in that shifting process? Many of our county party leaders are fantastic and passionate individuals, but they haven't the background in those intricacies in knowing how to do those pieces and parts. So we give them skills to do the practical application to make their job a lot easier. Then walking alongside them and giving the practical steps and everything from LNA testing, making sure that the ballot styles are set up correctly, and how do they liaise with their county elections office. In Texas, we have, it's about 12 different election environments. By the time you take into consideration the differences of sizes of counties and then countywide polling versus precinct-based polling versus the variance in the types of machines that we have, or even hand-marked ballots. So when you get all of these different environments, it has to be very county specific, because there are some threads that weave through that are the same, and that's the law, right? But how do you operate in a small county versus an extra large county like Harris County? That's where I live. But when you look at Harris County, that's a beast all into itself. So we're able to break it down in a palatable way so that each and every single county understands the risks, their weaknesses, but also their strengths, and how they can ensure that each and every voter's voice at the ballot box is well protected.
Well, and I think you bring up a really good point about different sized counties running things different ways, right? That's why the training that you do is so important with the practical experience. And I think it's also important to point out that there's a thirst for this. I mean, y'all had a seminar last year in Texas that had almost 300 participants, right?
Yeah.
Of this,
we had nearly 178 of 254 counties that were represented. And since that time, we've elevated our training platform. And so we have actually been able to have touch points in each and every single county across the state of Texas. And so that's exciting to see.
No, it is. I mean, one thing that we saw so much of in 2024 was just that our local election administrators were only getting advice from a Democrat Secretary of State or lawyers, leftist lawyers that were sent into these individual counties to talk about things. And so that's why this training that you're doing, where you're giving a good, solid interpretation, conservative interpretation, is so important. So It's just amazing work that I think needs to be highlighted. Another thing that you're doing that I think is super cool are your 10 talks, right? Not TED Talks, but 10 talks. Tell us a little bit about those and some of the topics that you've touched on recently.
Well, and with our Texas Election Network, our 10 Talks, we actually approach issues of controversy or confusion. And we examine the full depth and breadth of the issue. My philosophy and organizationally, what we have found to be the best approach is if we present the full picture on the issue, we don't tell folks what to think, we teach them how to think. We don't tell folks what to say, we teach them how to formulate opinions in a thoughtful manner so that, sometimes you agree to disagree, but we're able to hit issues in a way that is grounded in the law, but expands the mindset so that at the end of the day, folks are more well educated, even if they are not in support of an issue, even if they take an opposing perspective. At least when we begin educating people to have civil discourse and civility back in process, what we're finding is more conversations are happening, collaboration is happening. As a matter of fact, we've had some county parties, or county elections offices who have tuned in to our 10 talks just to kind of hear both sides of the issue. And then these county elections offices have reached out afterwards in these small counties that have teeny tiny budgets. And they're like, listen, we want to be more educated on that. Would you be willing to come in and train us and all of our workers who are serving in various different capacities, because we don't have the resource to travel to an SOS training, or we don't have the resource to get outside of our county. And so we've been able to go in and teach by the letter of the law. And so some folks have pushed back on me and said, well, why would you train across the aisle? Well, at the heart of it, if we're law abiding and we have a fair, safe, and secure election, that's not the partisan part. The partisan part comes into play when that voter walks into a booth and casts their vote. And I believe if we shore up our system and we can trust that our election is a good, well-run, legal election, then more voters will turn out. And ultimately, the true heart and voice of Texans will be heard at the ballot box. And I trust in that. I trust in who we are as Texans. And so that's really why we do what we do.
Well, one thing that we always talk about on this podcast is that the election process should not be partisan. The reason it's such a mess is because people have weaponized the election process
Right.
for an electoral advantage. And that is not what we want. All we want is election administrators to follow the law. And so anybody that's willing to get a training on how to follow the law, that is a good election administrator in our book.
Yeah. And so weaponized topics, we'll talk kind of about that because we do that on our 10 talks. One of those topics was countywide polling versus precinct-based polling. And, heading into it, I really had an idea and a thought that it was going to lean one direction or another. But once I had a county chair face off from a small county, face off from a large county, I learned a whole lot. And now my mind is expanded to the point of understanding that our elections really do need to have control at that county level, because each and every environment is so incredibly different. And I have a greater appreciation for process now.
Well, that's a great segue. Let's dive into Harris County for a minute, because I've got a working theory on Harris County. So first of all, right, at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which houses the Election Protection Project, we work great with the Texas legislators. I personally believe that for the most part, Texas has really solid elections. Everything can be improved, right? There's no process that's perfect, right? But I think Texas has pretty good election laws. Harris County, though, is always a black eye on Texas elections. It has been for just years. Now, I've got a working theory, and you brought this up a little bit, but Harris County allows countywide voting, which for our listeners that don't know, that means that you can go anywhere in Harris County and vote as long as you live in it. Now, that sounds convenient, right? You can vote at the precinct place close to your house. You can vote at the precinct place close to your work, to school, if you have to, whatever it is. But what that also means is that at every polling location, they print your ballot. They have to be able to print your ballot on demand, which means they have to have enough paper, which has been a problem. They have to have enough ink, which has been a problem. They have to have printers that function, and that's been a problem. They have to have workers that know how to run all of the machines, and that has been a problem. In a county as large as Harris County, countywide voting seems incredibly problematic to me. And you said this in a conversation we had earlier. It's not a matter of if something happens, it's a matter of when something. I think a lot of that is because of the complexity that comes with countywide voting. We see the same thing in Maricopa County, Arizona. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but more importantly, what happened on that conversation? Tell us a little bit about the insights you got from the 10 Talk on this topic.
Well, we had on the 10 Talk a small county versus Harris County, which is the largest county in Texas. And what I was surprised to hear is that our smaller counties, our rural counties, they really do have an appreciation for countywide polling. Much smaller numbers of polling locations, and many of their voters are spread out around the county, or even leave the county or cross over the county line to go work elsewhere. So they're just rushing to even make it back into county to be able to vote. And they are able to manage and control the environment because there's not a huge number of polling locations. Now let's contrast this to Harris County. Now, earlier I mentioned Texas has among the largest and longest election code in the country. Well, in Harris County, they have among the longest ballots. And we saw in previous elections where you're on a 2-page ballot, and that creates issues on those scanners and all sorts of technology issues. Where we are today with having more polling locations than some states, like the size of Rhode Island, it becomes very cumbersome to ensure that, one, you first have enough locations for polling locations. And when we previously operated in a world of precinct-based polling, you could pick up the historical trend of having the polling location at the exact same place over and over again. And not only did the location get accustomed to accommodating the election process, but so did workers working that election. I like to say that security starts with simplicity. And so when you have a repeat, redo, then it makes it a lot easier. But as we navigate countywide polling, we're finding that they're depending upon who's the election administrator or the county clerk running the election. Our polling locations have shifted, and that includes some historical locations. That also means in countywide polling that election workers that have worked traditionally at a given polling location, they may be scattered across the other side of the county. Now, in most average counties, that's not a big deal. It's a 20, 30-minute drive. But in Harris County, it could be an hour and 20 or hour and 30-minute drive in addition to a 12-hour plus prep time and shutdown, 14-hour shift. It becomes practically undoable in, a early voting scenario of 14 days. So it's just very, very cumbersome. So teams that had been working together for years, they no longer end up getting placed together. folks that are used to seeing voters' faces and know that they live and work within community, that goes by the wayside. So that immediately diminishes election integrity. You have staffing issues, again, because more workers aren't wanting to travel across the county. So then you have to hire inexperienced or ineffective workers, and training becomes a big gotcha at that point. And with the ever changing laws that we have, it's not a one and done, meaning you're at that one time and you know all that you need to know. So you really do need to trend up with working over several election cycles in order to be most effective. You have ballot accuracy issues because you've got to have all of these numerous ballot styles ready to be loaded. And that creates an issue in ensuring that the precinct in which that particular voter should be voting and the ballot style associated with that, you got to make sure that it's not loaded up to a precinct next door, which has a completely looking different ballot. So, in addition, voter education, understanding, and communication is the biggest issue I see. Voters are confused about where polling locations are, they're confused about processes. They don't have a comfort in walking into a polling location and even seeing familiar faces as they have in years past. And so that creates a lot of mistrust and distrust. Likewise, when you have workers who are inexperienced and are trying to learn the process, they're not as reassuring with the voters as folks that have done this a time or two. So it becomes a compounded effect. And while countywide polling was for efficiency and ease of voting, it's become a lot more cumbersome. And election integrity is where counties have seen the greatest hit.
Yeah, I know we as an organization are going to do some more work on this, but I'm kind of convinced at this point that countywide voting for a county the size of Harris County or Maricopa County, Texas, is just too unwieldy. There's too many moving parts to run a completely clean election there. And I think you said something that put it really into perspective. Harris County has more polling locations than some states. No state would go through a process that's that complex, right? And I loved it. I wrote it down. Security starts with simplicity. I think that's a principle that I'm going to apply in my work going forward. But yeah, I'm just kind of convinced right now that it's too complex in Harris County with all of this, the ability to vote everywhere. Melissa, let's be a little bit predictive here as we wrap up. What can we expect election integrity wise from 2026? What are the issues we need to keep an eye out for? Do we have any hope that Harris County will be any better? And what are some things that we should really be promoting in Texas?
Well, I will say that after the 88th legislative session, where Harris County was returned from an EA back to a county clerk, there has been some improvement in Harris County. So I'm very hopeful at that. Likewise, in Harris County, our county party leadership has some depth and breadth of experience, and I believe that will continue on, which helps with election integrity as well. There's some intentionality to make sure that the workers and watchers, not only in Harris County, but statewide, are well informed. And that's kind of why we exist. We're here to really stand in the gap. So I'm ever so hopeful looking at the trends since there's been a concentrated effort on election integrity in Texas, that cycle after cycle, the process of cleanup has not only begun, but is taking hold. And I'm hopeful with the stick-to-itiveness of the training that we've been issuing. And so I believe we'll be on top of the whack-a-mole, whatever comes down next, and we'll be training accordingly.
Melissa, I love it. Thank you for your work. Where can people find you on social media, and how can they get involved in the Texas Election Network?
Well, the first place to go is texaselectionnetwork.org. That's got a direct link to all of our social media on Facebook, X, Instagram, but you can also sign up for our newsletters. We do provide tips and insights on how to engage in the process, but also when we have the great events, not only the 10 talks, but our town halls, our trainings regionally as well as locally. So there are many ways that folks can get involved. Even our youth, we've launched a program at the youth level, getting student clerks involved and understanding, and our folks engaged in process as well at that younger age.
Melissa, that's just awesome. It's music to my ears. Getting young people involved in the work that you're doing to help everybody out. Thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you, Josh. We appreciate you. Thanks for leading on this.
This is Josh Findlay with the Election Protection Podcast. Thanks for joining us.